Kia ora, and I hope you enjoyed listening to the last recording that I made for this year's study period. In that last episode, we talked about Ralph as a significant character in this year's extended text Lord of the Flies. Specifically, we discussed his leadership as well as his vulnerability to the savage behaviours of his peers. In this following episode, I would like to turn our attention to the written text exam and discuss more generally the ways you could answer the questions using this character analysis. Today we're going to closely examine the questions included in the 2018 Show Understanding of Written Text Using Supporting Evidence exam paper. We will go through these questions in order, and you will find as we go that some of the questions are better suited to character study than others. The written text exam assesses your ability to recall information from your in-class study and apply it in a context you haven't prepared for. The questions are kept unfamiliar to you so that you are unable to come in with a pre-planned essay and regurgitate an essay that you wrote in class. This doesn't mean you can't prepare for it though. By ensuring that you are deeply knowledgeable in a few aspects of your text, you'll be best prepared to answer at least one of the questions given to you in the exam. In the paper, you will generally have at least one question on the following topics: character, idea, language feature, sometimes called method or technique, and setting. This means that while these questions are not the same ones you'll get in your exam at the end of the year, they are still useful to look at and practice with, as they are very similar to the ones you will find in front of you. It's always important to make note of the expectations of this paper, as well as easy steps that you should take in order to keep to the assessment guidelines, particularly that little bit that says using supporting evidence. Again, if you would like to take notes from this discussion, you can pause it at any time or refer to the written transcript linked below. But if you find it most helpful to just listen, then that's fine too. The first question in the 2018 written text exam asks us to describe at least one method the writer used to engage the reader within the text, and to explain how this method helped to engage you. The word highlighted in bold is our key word, and that key word is method, which they further explain as characters, events, relationships, narrative point of view, language techniques, style, conflicts, or structure. When looking at this question, of course, one of the keywords that stands out next is character. After studying Ralph, you would be looking for this word to select the appropriate question to show off your knowledge. One of the clearest things that stand out to me in the terms of method is symbolism. So I would talk about how the conch is used as a symbol of civilization, law, order, power, and how they use it in order to tell who is able to speak at that moment. So for our character analysis of Ralph, we've talked a little bit about how his ability to speak clearly, to turn Piggy's ideas into something that the boys will agree to, and by using the conch as a way of dictating who is able to speak, he is more civilized, and his civilization breaks down as he also is unable to speak or articulate his ideas in the meetings. So there's this lovely quote when the rules start breaking down where Ralph refuses to blow the conch, and he says, "If I blow the conch and they don't come back, then we've had it. We shan't keep the fire going, we'll be like animals and will never be rescued." So because he doesn't blow the conch, it still holds this idea of civilization in the back of their minds, and it hasn't been disproven yet. And of course, when the conch actually does break, that shows the breakdown in civilization. So you link in this idea of symbolism as well as this idea of conversation and the ability to speak representing that civilization. Your second point might be that moment where Ralph can't find the words in the meeting and Piggy has to remind him that it's all about the fire, and he actually prompts Ralph by saying the fire, and he goes, "Oh yes, and the fire needs to be lit." So that kind of idea of speech and his character as that speech breaks down would be a great way of using symbolism as your method to describe an important idea. So the second part of that question is how it helped to engage you. So that's where you're going to start twisting it into your own personal experience. So it might be that you are talking about how Ralph is influential, or it shows you a style of leadership. You might then start talking about that symbol of the conch and the breakdown of civilization demonstrated to you the idea that we are all able to go either way, to be good or to be bad based on our influences, and that it is society that holds us in check, and that you found this idea really engaging. So the key there is to use the keywords from the text in your link section of your paragraph answer in order to bring it back to the question. So you'll notice is that all of the things that I discussed really do dance around this idea of the question. This would probably not be the strongest question to talk about Ralph specifically in. If you were wanting to do a really basic answer, this might be perfect if you were going to talk about how the character of Ralph was really engaging because he was someone that you could relate your own experience to, because you too were able to be sort of swayed one way or the other, but it was through rules and society that you feel really kept you on track. So that's only one way to talk about that first question, but again, just want to drum in as strictly as I possibly can is that you need to use the keywords from that question, use a quote, and that gets you two of the points that you need to get that achieved. It's also being able to twist that question into what you want to talk about is really important for being able to be more flexible with your answer. So I want to talk a little bit about the second question there. Describe a key relationship between two or more characters or individuals in the text. Explain how this relationship helped you to understand at least one of these characters or individuals. So in there, the really important thing is the first bit is a key relationship between two or more. So you need to talk about a relationship between at least two. However, in that second part, I'll just want to point out that it helped you understand only one of those characters. So you might talk about in this one the relationship between Piggy and Ralph, and you might talk about the role that Piggy has in being the brains of the operation and how that helped you understand that Ralph was willing to listen to people that perhaps other people wouldn't, just because of their own physical, Piggy doesn't really look like someone that would be a good leader, and so Ralph has to be the face of that. But you could talk about the relationship between those two characters and how that actually teaches Ralph to be a lot more caring throughout the course of the novel, because just like everyone else, he did really start with basically hating on Piggy in the beginning and made fun of him, didn't even bother to learn his name, but by the end of it he is weeping for the loss of that character. So you could talk about how that helped the relationship between Piggy and Ralph, helped you understand that the way that a person presents themselves or their physical appearance sometimes isn't as important for development, for growth, and that each person that you interact with can shape you in an irreversible way. The other relationships that could be really good to talk about are the relationship between Ralph and Jack, and you might talk about how Jack challenged Ralph. He put a whole lot of obstacles in his way, and he made Ralph step up in a way that he otherwise may not have had to. So you could talk about the fact that Jack comes in and he challenges for the chieftainship in that moment there, and then sort of runs away saying, well, I'm not playing with you anymore. And you can talk about that idea of rules and concepts and coming to the table and discussions. You could contrast the two characters to help you and discuss how that helped you understand one of them. So you might talk about how Ralph represents civilization and Jack represents savagery, and those two characters together helped you understand the roles that each of those play in our own decision makings, in our own lives, is that we are swayed between the things that we want to do and the things that we have to out of obligation. So you'd probably argue that Ralph does a lot more things out of obligation than Jack does, and you could talk about that and maybe even link it to your own personal experience between wanting to do things versus actually having to do things. So that's not very clear, is it? But what I'm trying to say is that kind of battle within yourself to do things that society expects from you versus things that will actually bring you personal joy. So that's question 2. Question 3, describe at least one way a character or individual changed in the text and how this change was important to the text as a whole. Ralph goes through so many changes. So you might talk about, again, linking back to just how we did in that first bit, about the breakdown of civilization of all of the characters. And the moments that you might want to talk about are right in the beginning, that Ralph was a character who displayed leadership, he was coherent, cohesive in his presentations, and he kept the boys all on track. You could talk about in the middle how he started to lose his sense of articulation, and he was unable to fully express his ideas as he started to lose his own personal sense of civilization. And then you could talk about at the end how all of the boys, after swaying, after the death of Simon, who was caring, after the death of Piggy, who was intelligent, after the loss of those qualities, the humanity, as we would describe it, was stripped away from the boys, and how all of them became perpetrators of violence rather than being victims of this horrible situation that they were in. So that second part, how this change was important to the text as a whole, that really, to me, I can see that you need something from the beginning, you need something from the middle, and you need something at the end, and you need to discuss why that change occurred, and that always links back to author's purpose. In question 4, one challenging setting. Now, the thing is this one here probably would be like, oh, well, that's a fantastic idea to talk about the island. I would possibly argue is that setting doesn't have to be the physical place that it is set in. So one challenging setting, and how that helped you understand an important idea, that setting might be World War II. It might be the challenging setting of being in a war-torn society, but being away from that and being a sort of microcosm of the rest of the adult world. So you might talk about how, so you might talk about the difference between adults, at war, their violence, and the violence of the children, and how that helps you understand that humans at our core are flawed, because it's not just adults who are being violent, but children, and that it's not something that we are grown to or taught, but it's something that is, innate within all of us. And then let's look at question 5. Describe at least one memorable idea in the text and explain why that idea was memorable to you. So that little bit of that word you, that means that you need to bring your own personal inflection to it. So that doesn't mean you could draw on your own personal experience and talk about, experiences that you have been through yourself, or you can talk about it as in the generic you of youth in New Zealand. So that's something to keep in mind. It doesn't have to be something that's applicable to you. You can absolutely lie and say that you are from somewhere else and you understand this because you're of said culture. Okay, it's difficult to talk about a culture you're not a part of, but that could be something that you talk about, or of course it's something really strong and something that you are passionate would work really well for this question. So at least one memorable idea, doesn't have to be one. So you could talk about civilization versus savagery. You could talk also about humans are the worst kind of beast. You could talk about mass hysteria. Okay, you could talk about all three of those and link them all and say, these ideas were memorable because they show different aspects and facets of the human experience. So for Ralph, I think that character links best to the idea of civilization and savagery, and again, that breakdown of communication and that ability to articulate your ideas is the crux of that civilization versus savagery dichotomy. Another one, of course, is the rotting of the clothes. That's also another symbol of civilization versus savagery. And question 6, describe the beginning and ending of the text. Explain how the beginning and the ending were connected. That one, okay, really, really difficult for us to link with our text, because the beginning, they turn up out of nowhere. There is no sort of, there's there's no inciting incident that gets them there. They just kind of arrive, and then at the ending they do get rescued, and that's again an entirely different scenario. So for this, the beginning and ending are connected very loosely. You could possibly twist it and argue that they are connected in the form of their introspective, that Ralph is considering his place free of adults, and now in the last moments he is considering the growing up that he's had to do over the course of living on the island. And you could also argue that perhaps more thematically at the beginning he is completely out of place, so he arrives and he's someone sort of outside of the world that he now inhabits, and now after going through that experience he no longer fits into the world of the English boy. So that one I think is really loose. The main thing to do is that you need to look through each of the questions really carefully. You want to look for the keywords that stand out to you in terms of, do those link with any of the ideas that we have discussed. So if you're going to write about character, look for the questions that say character in them. If you're going to talk about an idea, find the questions that say idea. Idea is a tricky one just because normally they alternate idea with theme or message or intention. Those seem to be all of the same, but you're wanting to make sure that you're using the correct keyword, of course. So I think I'm going to try and stop that there. I think I rambled for way too long, but I'll leave it there. Hopefully you found something at least a little bit useful. I will try and put a compilation of quotes or just a link to a website that has a compilation of quotes around Ralph to help you with your study. But otherwise, good luck!